The U.S. federal government affects all of our lives. It is made up of three different branches. The branches were established by the U.S. Constitution, which was adopted in 1787. The first branch serves in the Capitol building, the U.S. Capitol building, and it's the legislative branch. Now, there are two parts to the legislative branch. There's the Senate, which is made up of 100 members, 2 from each state, and there's the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives is made up of 435 members. So all told, there are 535 members of the legislative branch. And these are designated based on census numbers to each state. And so a state like California has a lot more representatives than a state like Delaware. The second branch is the White House, and this is the White House, and it's the executive branch. The executive branch includes the president, and you would have the vice president and the cabinet. There are 15 different cabinet positions ranging from the Secretary of State, which is the oldest, most prestigious of the cabinet offices, and all the way to the Department of Homeland Security, which is a more recent creation. The third branch of the government is the judiciary, which is housed in the Supreme Court, which is the top court of the land. Now, the Supreme Court, underneath them, there's the Court of Appeals, and underneath those are district courts. And very few cases actually make it all the way up to the Supreme Court. Most cases are heard at the district courts, and then if one of the sides appeals, it may be heard by the Court of Appeals, and then the Supreme Court is the final arbitrator in any lawsuit that is filed. And so these are the three different branches of government, and they all have different powers. And the Constitution was structured this way so that there are checks and balances between each of them, and they each have a different function. The legislative function is to make laws. And that's why we hear about different congressmen or senators that may be arguing over which laws we should have. The executive branch, they enforce the laws. And the Supreme Court and our court system, they oversee the laws and decide which ones are constitutional and which are not, and so they evaluate them. They evaluate the laws. And they can determine if a law should be considered unconstitutional and removed from the books. And so these three branches of government make up the U.S. federal government, and we should know how they are structured and the different divisions of them.
A political party is an organization that advocates a particular ideology and seeks to gain power within government. So basically, a political party has certain ideas about how government should run and certain policies it would like to enact. So it advocates for those policies, and people will run for elected office as part of that political party. And if they get elected, then they have succeeded in gaining power within government, and they can then try to enact those policies that they believe in. Now, in the United States, we have what's known as a two-party system. This means that there are two dominant political parties. And this makes it difficult for other parties to win elections. So the two dominant parties in the U.S. are the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. So in almost every election, either a Democrat or a Republican will be elected. The Democratic Party is headed up by the DNC, which is the Democratic National Committee, and it is known as the Liberal Party. It is sometimes identified by the color blue and the donkey. The Republican Party is headed up by the RNC, which is the Republican National Committee, the equivalent of the DNC. And it is known as the Conservative Party. It is sometimes identified by the color red or the elephant. Now, earlier I mentioned the other parties that are out there and how it is difficult for them to win elections. There are some smaller parties out there that may occasionally win an election, but not very many. And so there are many small parties out there, but some of the more well-known smaller parties are the Constitution Party, the Green Party, the Libertarian Party, and the Reform Party. So that's a brief look at political parties. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution has had a huge impact on the United States. It was ratified on December 6, 1865. So the 13th Amendment was passed during the Reconstruction era. And the Reconstruction era existed after the Civil War ended. So this was a time when the Confederate states that had broken off from the whole United States were joining back together with the northern states to form one complete U.S. again. And so this was a difficult time for the country. A lot of laws had to be passed to help figure out how this was going to happen, how all these states were going to join back together. And in addition, many of the Confederate soldiers had to be granted pardons because they were considered in opposition to the U.S., and so they were committing illegal acts. And so in order for them not to go to prison, they had to be granted presidential pardons. Now, the 13th Amendment freed all slaves, and it also legally forbade slavery in the U.S. So it freed all current slaves and said that slavery could not exist again. Now, slaves were freed without giving monetary compensation to the slave holders. And this is because this was considered an illegal act now, and so it didn't make sense to give money to the people because they were doing something illegal. And it's interesting, though, because these slaveholders saw their slaves as their property. And so since they were losing their property, they would want to be compensated for it. So this was a huge financial loss to the slaveholders. Now, what kind of impact did the 13th Amendment have? Well, for one, it changed the societal composition of the South and some of the border states. Because before, African Americans were generally slaves, but now they're just normal citizens. It also changed the economy. Because like I said earlier, the slaves were considered property, and so these slaveholders had to pay for them initially, but after that, they didn't have to pay wages. Now, if they were going to hire African Americans, they had to pay them wages for their work, and so this changed the economy. In some cases, maybe it was too expensive to own these slaves or to employ these slaves. And so it created economic change in the South. And then civil rights was also born after the 13th Amendment happened, because now at first the idea was these African Americans needed to be freed from slavery. But now that they've been freed, they're not on equal ground with the white people of the U.S. And so that's what happened with the civil rights movement, pretty much starting at this point all the way up into not that long ago, as African Americans and others on their behalf were fighting for equal rights to that of the other Americans. Now, to give you a full context of the 13th Amendment, it has two sections, and so Section 1 says, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, where the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction." So this was saying, like I said earlier, that slavery can never exist again. People can only be made to work, basically, if it was punishment for a crime that they had been convicted for. And so basically what was happening is these slaves were being treated like criminals, even though they were not. And then Section 2 says Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. And so that's some of the legislation I was talking about that was born out of the Reconstruction era. So this 13th Amendment was passed, but now other laws had to be put in place to help this process of the slaves being freed go smoothly. The 14th Amendment was ratified on July 9th, 1868, during the Reconstruction era of the United States. The 14th Amendment declared that all persons born or naturalized were U.S. citizens. So basically, if someone was born in the U.S. or naturalized, they were considered a U.S. citizen. And then it also declared that all citizens were entitled to equal rights regardless of race. So the 14th Amendment basically did two things. First, it defined who a U.S. citizen was, and then it said that all of these citizens have equal rights. Now, the amendment fell short of giving black men the right to vote, but it paved the way for the 15th Amendment, which did give black men the right to vote. Now, this amendment angered women's rights activists because it made the right to vote a male right. And it wasn't much later until the 19th Amendment that women were given the right to vote. Now, the major impact of the 14th Amendment was that human rights were granted at the state as well as the national level through the Due Process Clause. So I'm going to write that on the board because that's really important to remember, the Due Process Clause. So the 14th Amendment said that all people, all citizens, cannot be convicted of a crime unless they've been through the due process of law. And so we could also say that the 14th Amendment granted due process to all citizens. So basically these minority groups, or the black people, couldn't be discriminated against by the court system. They were given the same rights to a fair trial under the Bill of Rights that white Americans were given as well. So again, the 14th Amendment did basically two things. It defined who U.S. citizens were and said that they were all given equal rights. The 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870. Now, this 15th Amendment granted black men the right to vote. It passed because Confederate states were forced to comply based on the Military Reconstruction Act. The Military Reconstruction Act was passed a few years prior by Congress, despite President Johnson's veto. And so this put the Confederate states under military control to aid in the process of reconstruction of the southern states being joined together again with the northern states. And so as part of the Military Reconstruction Act, they had to pass the 15th Amendment. And women's rights activists also opposed the amendment because it granted the right to vote to males only. So you can see how much opposition and tension there was with the 15th Amendment because women's rights activists opposed it, as well as these Confederate and Southern states who had a lot of prejudice against blacks. And so really only through the Military Reconstruction Act could the 15th Amendment most likely come about. Now, women also wanted the right to vote, or these women rights activists wanted the right to vote as well. And so that didn't come about until the 19th Amendment, which came about much later. And so they opposed it because this amendment was making the right to vote a male right only. Because although it was giving it to blacks, and so now it wasn't, before it was just a white male right, and now it was cutting across cultural lines. And so now no longer was it a right of one ethnicity, but it was still just a right of one gender. And so the push for women's rights eventually resulted in the 19th Amendment. But here we're just focusing on the 15th Amendment, and this was the last of three very historic amendments in the U.S. relating to Reconstruction. That's the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And these had a huge impact on life in the U.S. because they put an end to the era of slavery and were the first steps in giving freedom and equal rights to black people at the state and national levels.
Weather versus climate. Weather involves daily conditions in the atmosphere that affect temperature, precipitation, wind speed, air pressure, and other factors. So weather is involving the daily conditions of things, such as temperature, precipitation, how much rain, snow, sleet, or hail we get, the wind speed and direction, the air pressure, any kind of weather-related things, but on a daily basis. Weather focuses on the short term, meaning what conditions will be like today, tomorrow, or over the next few days. Now, climate collects and stores information about daily and yearly weather conditions in a region over a long period of time. Climate takes into account average monthly and yearly temperatures, average precipitation over long periods of time, and the average season of an area, the average growing season of an area. So climate is going to focus on the long term. What conditions will be like from year to year or during certain months or seasons. Climate isn't going to talk about what happens today or tomorrow. It's going to be telling you, in general, in August, the weather is like this. In general, this area of the world will receive this many inches of rain. It's not going to take into account, it's going to take into account the day-to-day weather events, but it's not going to be predicting day-to-day events for you. So weather is short-term. It's more about what's going to be today, tomorrow, the next day. Climate is long-term, what the weather is going to be like in a specific area during a specific time of the year, a specific season or month. It can't predict down to the very day what temperatures will be like, but it can tell you on average what things will be like over a span of days. So climate is used to project more long-term, more big picture weather ideas. So weather and climate are both physical systems that affect geography. However, though they deal with similar information, that information is measured, compiled, and analyzed differently. So just remember, weather is going to involve the more day-to-day events dealing with temperature, precipitation, wind speed, air pressure, anything weather-related is going to be weather if it's short-term. Is it happening today, tomorrow, in a 10-day forecast? Climate is going to be more long-term. Is it going to happen this way every season, every year during the winter? Is it going to be about this temperature? Is our growing season always going to be about this long? Will it always be sunny during this time, or light during this time and dark during this time? So the climate is going to focus more on long-term, where weather is going to focus more on short-term, day-to-day. Geographical features. There are many commonly identified geographical features. Plateaus are elevated, but they are flat on top. Some plateaus are very dry, such as the Kenya Plateau, because surrounding mountains prevent them from receiving moisture, either in the form of rainfall or simply clouds and humidity being able to develop in that area. So, some plateaus are very dry, but not all of them. All plateaus are going to be elevated areas that are flat on top. Plateau, flat. Remember flat, and that will help you remember. Plateaus are the flat areas, and that is what makes it a very specific geographical feature, is that they are flat on top. Deserts are another common geographical feature, and deserts receive less than 10 inches of rain per year. So that's what classifies an area as a desert, where you may receive a couple of inches of rain overnight. A desert is only going to see 10 inches of rain or less per year. And they are usually large areas. You won't usually find a small area that's classified as a desert. It's usually going to be a really large area, such as the Sahara Desert in Africa or the Australian outback. Because if there's an area that's only receiving 10 inches of rain per year, it's usually going to be a geographic location that's spread out over a large area and then slowly transitions into areas with more rain. You usually won't find just one little spot. Deltas occur at river mouths. And because rivers carry sediment down to the delta, these areas are often very fertile. So deltas of rivers would be good areas to grow crops because lots of sediment with new, fresh nutrients would constantly be being transported down to that delta area. Mesas are flat, steep-sided mountains or hills. And this term is also sometimes used to refer to plateaus. So a mesa is different in that it's at the top of a steep-sided mountain or hill, where plateaus could be elevated, but they don't necessarily have to be at the top of a mountain or a hill. They could just be raised up and then go for a really long way without being the top of a mountain or a hill. It could just be a big break in elevation. Now, the term plateau can still be used for mesas because plateaus are flat areas of land. Basins are areas of low elevation where rivers drain. So you've heard of river basins probably, and where a river winds its course, the basin is the area that's kind of carved out by the river and that is a lower elevation than the surrounding land. Foothills are the transition area between the plains and the mountains, so flat lower lands and high mountains. And they are usually made up of hills that gradually increase in size as they get closer to the mountain range. So foothills, you have a flat plain, and then slowly you have higher and higher hills until you get to the mountain peaks. And last we have marshes and swamps. And these are also lowlands like your basin, but they are very wet and usually spread out, and they are largely covered in vegetation such as reeds and rushes. Where a river basin could still hold shrubbery and trees, marshes and swamps are going to be so saturated with water almost year-round so that the only things that can grow there are water plants such as reeds and rushes. Now there are other geographical features. We mentioned mountains, we mentioned rivers, we mentioned plains. All of those are geographical features. These are just some that you might not see as commonly, but they're still important for you to know. The Egyptians. The Egyptians lived in a concentrated area along the lower parts of the Nile River around 3000 BC. And they were able to predict flooding and control irrigation, which made the Nile River Valley a very fertile area. And since they grew surplus crops, the Egyptians had time to pursue other interests. So the Egyptians lived in the Nile River Valley, the lower part of the land along the lower part of the Nile River, and they could predict when floods would occur, and they also had control of irrigation techniques. So they were able to farm a lot of that land and grow enough crops that they had plenty to spare. They had some to store up for the future, for times of drought or famine, and they had time to do other things. So they were definitely a farming community, but they had lots of other interests because their civilization developed in a very fertile area that made for an easier life than some of the other civilizations that were developing around the same time period. So the Egyptians developed writing. They had that extra time. They developed a system of writing. They farmed minerals from the valley and surrounding desert. So they figured out what minerals they could use from the ground, and they would go and farm them as well, or mine them out, because they had all this extra time. So they farmed the land, but they also farmed the minerals. They developed a vast trading network. So they have all this extra food, they've got these minerals, they can write, they can make jewelry, pottery. They had a lot of art, and their art and architecture were modeled throughout other civilizations in the surrounding areas as the Egyptians developed more and more. So they had a vast trading network. They would trade very far away from where they lived, and people would come from far away to trade with them. They developed a military to defend against attacks. So you can imagine living in this fertile valley. Other civilizations are going to say, hey, that spot looks really great. I want to live there. I want our people to live there. So the Egyptians did have to defend Egypt against attacks because this Nile River Valley was a pretty popular place, and people saw that it was good land and they tried to make it their own. So Egypt had to develop a military. They formulated an effective system of medicine. So they were able to record symptoms and say, oh, this looks similar to when this other person was sick. This is what we gave them and it made it better. This person doesn't look like they're getting better. They may have this much time to live. This person has a wound. If we put this medicine and wrap it up, it will get better. So they had an effective system of medicine. They organized collective construction. In fact, one of the Egyptians' greatest achievements were their pyramids. And the pyramids were not something that just a few people could build. These took lots and lots of time and lots of manpower to build. So the pyramids are something that a lot of people associate with Egypt even today. And back then, remember I said that a lot of other people modeled the Egyptians' art and architecture. One of their architectural things that people wanted to copy were the pyramids. They were very impressive. Even now they're very impressive, but for them to be able to make it back then without all of the modern equipment that we have was very impressive. So pyramids were originally built as burial sites for pharaohs who were the leaders in Egypt, and they were believed to continue ruling in the afterlife. So they made these huge pyramids and they buried the pharaohs in there after they died, and they buried them with food and with servants and with animals, with gold, jewels. They wanted them to be entertained and fed and have plenty to drink and have plenty of people to wait on them in the afterlife as well. And so they buried all of this with them, thinking it would all go with the pharaoh to the next life. Peasants worked on the pyramids in exchange for food and shelter. So for people who maybe didn't have their own area of land, people who wanted these pyramids built would say, okay, you come build on the pyramid, we'll feed you and make sure you've got a place to live. The shape of the pyramids is meant to symbolize the slanting rays of the sun, and if you think about the way that the pyramids slant down, and the sloping sides were also thought to help the souls of the pharaohs climb to the sky to join the other gods. So slanting rays down from the sun, but also it slants up toward the sun from the ground, and so the pharaoh's soul was supposed to be assisted by those sloping sides. It could make its way up toward the sky to join the other gods. And just to give you an example of how much time and how much labor a pyramid might take, the largest pyramid from this time took around 20 years and around 100,000 laborers to complete. So if a pharaoh came into power, he better start getting his pyramid built really quickly, because by the time that it was done, it would be about the time he was going to be needing it. So the Egyptians were a very accomplished people. They were very ahead of their time, both in architecture and art, and they lived in the fertile Nile River Valley around 3000 BC. The Middle Ages, the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire existed from 962 to 1806. Otto the Great reunited most of the lands of Charlemagne's empire. So after Charlemagne died and his empire was split up among his 3 grandsons, the lands weren't going to be all under one ruler again until Otto the Great was able to do that, or at least reunite most of those lands. When Otto was crowned emperor by the Pope in 962, the lands under his control became known as the Holy Roman Empire. Otto's crowning marked the beginning of a succession of emperors that would continue unbroken for over 8 centuries. And that period would be when the Holy Roman Empire existed. Now, for Otto to be a Holy Roman Emperor, he had to be crowned by the Pope. So Charlemagne was also crowned by the Pope and was the first Holy Roman Emperor, but the Holy Roman Empire isn't considered to exist until 962 when Otto the Great is crowned emperor. And from then on, there is an unbroken line of succession of emperors for over 8 centuries. Now, Otto involved the church in his government. The church helped put him in power. The church crowned him emperor. And so, in turn, he was involving the church in his government. But he tried to limit its power. He still wanted to be able to have a lot of the control of his empire. But the church was very powerful. And the church leaders slowly but steadily acquired power until they had great control over even the everyday activities of most citizens. So Otto was still the emperor, but the church leaders had a lot of the power, and they were the ones making a lot of the rules. All of that power corrupted many of the church leaders. So where the church is supposed to be the example for people to follow, and they're supposed to be following all the rules in the Bible, they're supposed to be Christians, they're supposed to be doing the right things, many of them were corrupted by the power. And an example of that is that many church officials practice simony, which is the buying and selling of important positions. So a church leader may have gotten in power by buying themselves that position. They could have said, oh, I really want to be a church leader because they have so much power. Well, I've got this money, I'll give it to the church and they'll make me one of their leaders. Or a church leader may say, oh, well, we need some more money, or we need that plot of land. If we make the owner of that land one of our leaders, then we can have that land and do with it as we want to. So the buying and selling of these important church positions was a very common practice during this time because the church had become corrupt. One of Otto's legacies was the rivalry between the church and the state. So this is going to continue throughout the whole of the Holy Roman Empire, where the church is corrupt, the church has a lot of power, and whoever the emperor is going to be fighting to keep his government in control, or at least to have a good portion of the control, which was not easy to do since the church had already become so powerful. And the Holy Roman Empire was going to consist of emperors that had been crowned by the church. So there was always going to be this relationship between the emperor and the church. Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus was an explorer from Genoa, Italy. As an adult, Columbus worked as a trader, traveling mostly by sea. So Columbus had a lot of experience at sea. He was an experienced sailor. He had done this for many years of his life. Then he came up with an idea. After many years of presenting his idea, Columbus finally received financial backing from King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain in 1492. And this was his idea. He wanted to find a new trade route to Asia, which lay to the east. So Asia lay to the east of them, but he wanted to get there by sailing west. He thought if he started here and went far enough this way, he'd circle back around and hit here. And he would have been right, except that America was in the way. You had two continents, North and South America, that were not going to go away. So his plan didn't work out quite like he thought it was going to. Now, he tried for several years to get people to accept this plan, but since they had just come up with the route to go south of the tip of Africa to get to Asia, people weren't as interested in it. Finally, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain said, okay, we feel like maybe there's an idea here, we'll support you and see how it goes. So Columbus was given 3 ships for his first voyage: the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And he eventually landed near South America. But he thought he had reached the Indies, which is what they called Asia at that time. So Columbus made 4 voyages in all to what he called the West Indies. So he thought by sailing west, he'd reached the Indies, and he called them the West Indies. He made 4 voyages there, and he kept thinking he was reaching the Indies. Now, other people didn't think so. They thought he was getting to different land. But Columbus refused to believe that. He held on to the belief that he had reached the West Indies as he planned to. Now, he didn't discover a new trade route to the Asian Indies. He thought he had, but he hadn't. But he did discover a new trade route. He discovered new land. He discovered a place that had lots of new resources and that opened the door for exploration and colonization of the Americas. So he is credited with the discovery of the Americas. However, Columbus never would admit that he had discovered new lands. He maintained that he had reached the West Indies. Now, he did name some of the islands he found and claimed them for Spain, but he didn't think that he'd reached a completely new continent. He thought he had just reached part of the West Indies, and he refused to believe otherwise and maintained that he had reached the West Indies until the day he died, which is why possibly the Americas aren't named after Columbus, but instead after Amerigo Vespucci, who actually claimed he discovered new lands whenever he came to the Americas. So Columbus was the first person to get to the Americas. He just didn't admit that he'd done it. The Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is a statement that was adopted by the Continental Congress on July 4th, 1776, and it was adopted by the 13 American colonies who formed the Continental Congress. Now, the Declaration of Independence said that King George III of Britain had violated the rights of American colonists. He had put into effect different laws and taxes on the American colonists that seemed unfair to them and took away some of their rights. So the Continental Congress convened to try to come up with a solution. Fighting had already been going on for over a year at the time that this Second Continental Congress occurred, and they decided there wasn't going to be a peaceful way to solve things with Britain. So they declared themselves independent. They said King George had violated the rights of these American colonists, and therefore it announced that the 13 colonies considered themselves as independent states, no longer part of the British Empire. Instead, they said that they formed a new union of those 13 states to be known as the United States of America. So they had tried to work things out peacefully. King George did not take back those laws and taxes. Instead, he fought the American colonists whenever they rebelled against following those laws and paying those taxes. And so after a year of fighting, the Continental Congress met again, and they formed this Declaration of Independence. They declared that they were independent of Britain and that they were their own nation now, to be known as the United States of America. They were no longer part of the British Empire. John Adams was a leader at the Continental Congress, and he pushed for independence. So at first, not everyone was for independence. They thought that was a little radical. They thought maybe they could still make things work with Britain. But after a year of fighting, John Adams was still pushing independence, and it was sounding better to everyone. So on July 2nd, 1776, all 13 colonies unanimously approved this idea to declare themselves independent from Britain. John Adams convinced the committee to allow Thomas Jefferson to write the draft. So Thomas Jefferson wrote the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. Congress edited the draft, and the final version was ratified, which means approved. Everyone agreed to it, and it was ratified by all 13 colonies, or states as they were to be known, on July 4th, 1776. So this date is our date of independence. The day we celebrate as Independence Day was the day that our Declaration of Independence had been edited, and everyone signed it and approved it. Everyone who was there from the 13 colonies as representatives at this Continental Congress. Now, Jefferson was influenced by John Locke, who was a 17th century writer, and this was evidenced in his ideas about natural rights. John Locke had written about natural rights, and Jefferson included this in his declaration. Jefferson asserted that people had natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So John Locke had said people have the right to life, liberty, and private property. So Jefferson subbed happiness for private property. While, of course, I'm sure he still meant that people could have private property, he put it in a little bit broader terms. Everyone is entitled to life. Everyone is entitled to liberty, to be free, and everyone is entitled to pursue happiness. And they felt like King George had infringed on some of those natural rights. And so Jefferson was using most of what John Locke had written whenever he wrote life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as natural rights that were being violated in the Declaration of Independence. Now, Jefferson felt and had the Declaration reflect that the purpose of government was to protect the rights of people. Individual rights were more important than the individual's obligations to the state. King George had the opposite idea, and he was trying to force his laws and his taxes on the colonists. So people who were signing the Declaration of Independence were agreeing that people's individual rights were more important than their obligation to the state or to their government. So people's individual rights should come first, and then their obligations to the state. And that is what Jefferson was trying to reflect in the Declaration of Independence. So on July 4th, 1776, all 13 colonies, all representatives from those 13 colonies, to be known as states, ratified the Declaration of Independence, which declared that King George had violated rights of American colonists, and now those 13 colonies were to be known as the United States of America, a separate new nation that was no longer tied to the British Empire. The First and Second Continental Congress. The First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia on September 5th, 1774. and it was made up of delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies. So this Continental Congress was called when there was a lot of turmoil between the 13 colonies in North America and Britain, who was supposed to be the country that was in charge of these colonies. Now, the colonies weren't cooperating with what Britain wanted them to do, and the colonists felt like they weren't being treated fairly, so they didn't feel any urge to cooperate. However, they didn't want to go to full-scale war with Britain, so they came up with the First Continental Congress. They sent delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies to try to solve this problem. Georgia did not send a delegate because they were having problems on their frontier with Indians and were hoping that Britain would help them with that, and so they didn't want to get involved in the Continental Congress because they were afraid then Britain wouldn't help them, and they had their own issues with the Indians at their borders, Indians being the Native Americans. So, at the First Continental Congress, these 12 delegates had a goal, and their goal was to achieve a peaceful agreement with Britain. They did not want to go to full-scale war with Britain. They knew that Britain was very powerful. They would be outnumbered if they sent a bunch of people over there, and they just basically wanted to get along but not be treated unfairly. So, the Congress affirmed loyalty to Britain and agreed to let Parliament dictate foreign affairs in the colonies. So they said, okay, Britain, we're loyal to you. Parliament can say what goes on with the foreign affairs in the colonies. However, these colonists demanded that the Intolerable Acts be repealed. And the Intolerable Acts were a series of laws or taxes that were enforced, and some of them were taxes on goods that were just unbelievably high and weren't really warranted. Britain was just being greedy and wanting to make more money off of things than they needed to. And some of the other ones were just things that seemed unreasonable. They were forced to quarter British soldiers in their homes, whether they wanted to or not, and this just led to a lot of different things where they felt like their rights were being invaded, and they also didn't have representation back in Britain. There weren't an equal number of colonists over there in Parliament to represent them, so they felt like they shouldn't be paying as much in taxes. So there were a lot of different issues going on there, but the main thing that the colonists wanted was to have these different laws, known as the Intolerable Acts, repealed. And they instituted a trade embargo with Britain until this happened. So they said, okay, we're not trading with Britain anymore. We're not going to buy any more of their stuff. We're not going to ship them any more of our stuff until they repeal the Intolerable Acts. Otherwise, if they did that, we'd be happy to say we're loyal to Britain. Parliament can be in charge of foreign affairs over here in the colonies. That is not what happened. They did not reach their peaceful agreement. King George III of Britain declared the colonies must submit. They must do as Britain was saying, or face military action. So they've been threatened now. We aren't listening to all this, is what Britain is saying, King George is saying. We don't care that you want to be peaceful, you want this repealed. We're not doing any of that. You listen to us, or there's going to be military action. There will be consequences. So assemblies gathered weapons and formed militias, groups of citizen armies, basically. And these assemblies gathered in all of the colonies. Each colony had an assembly, and it was basically just a group that had collected weapons and sort of formed a militia. The British did not like the assemblies meeting. They didn't want them getting together and making any plans. So they were supposed to break up any assemblies that they wandered onto. And on April 19th, 1775, the British military was ordered to end a meeting of the Massachusetts Assembly. Now, the armed colonists that were in the assembly, because remember, they gathered weapons and had formed militias, the armed colonists resisted the British soldiers, and battles ensued on the Lexington Common. Now, these battles became known as the battles of Lexington and Concord, because that is where the battles between the British military and these armed colonists that were part of the Massachusetts Assembly occurred. And the battles of Lexington and Concord became the first battles of the American Revolution. So the colonists tried to come to a peaceful solution. It didn't work out. King George said, you're going to listen or there's going to be military action. When the colonists resisted and didn't listen, there was military action. Battles ensued, and the battles of Lexington and Concord became the first battles of the American Revolution. So, war has started. Now we come to the Second Continental Congress. Clearly, their solutions that they came up with up here did not work, so the delegates met again. This time, delegates from all 13 colonies came. Georgia was included. Georgia realized, Britain's not helping me with my Indian problem. I need to join with the rest of the colonies. So, delegates from all 13 colonies met in Philadelphia on May 10, 1775, less than a month after Lexington and Concord. So this is April 19th. On May 10th, less than a month after Lexington and Concord, they met. They realized, hey, the British mean business. They're clearly not going to come to a peaceful solution like we wanted. They're not going to repeal the Intolerable Acts. We have to form our own army. We've got to figure out what we're going to do because Britain is definitely going to fight back. So they focused on the defense of the American colonies and local government. Since Britain had been in charge of their government before, they had to come up with their own local government system. So part of what they did was work on local government. Part of what they did was talk about their defense. What were they going to do? So the delegates also discussed declaring independence from Britain. And this was a drastic thing because Britain was controlling all of them. But they said, you know what? We can declare ourselves independent from Britain. They're fighting us. They don't want to do what we want. It's hard to get across that whole big ocean to be over there and actually be represented in Parliament. Why not just have our own separate country over here? And many delegates were in favor of this option. So they established an army and named George Washington commander-in-chief. Now, at this point, they did not decide to declare independence. They discussed declaring independence from Britain. Many were in favor, but they hadn't declared it yet. They did establish an army and make George Washington commander-in-chief. They did discuss the defense of the American colonies, which resulted in this army, and they set up a provisional local government, an idea for how that was going to be run. However, by 1776, the delegates realized there was no turning back from full-scale war with Britain, and after this was over, there was no way they were going to patch things up. So they drafted the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. So your First Continental Congress was about trying to find a peaceful solution with Britain. The Second Continental Congress decided there can't be a peaceful solution. Britain's definitely going to fight us and is not going to give in. So they decided to form their own army. They chose a leader, and eventually they drafted the Declaration of Independence to declare themselves independent of Britain. The Lewis and Clark Expedition. The purchase of the Louisiana Territory in 1803 more than doubled the size of the United States. President Thomas Jefferson wanted to have this newly acquired land mapped and explored, since most of the territory was considered wilderness. It was unexplored. Nobody knew what was out there. They knew Native Americans were there, but it hadn't been mapped out and no one had laid claim to it out past the Louisiana Territory. Everything in the Louisiana Territory had just been purchased from France, so the United States did own it, but they didn't know what was out there. So Thomas Jefferson wanted to have an expedition sent out there to explore it, map it out, let everyone know what was out there. Jefferson wanted to ensure America's claim on the land. He felt like if he didn't get out there soon enough with Americans and start settling the land, laying a claim to it, proving that it was their land, other nations like Britain or other European countries would come in and say that they were staking claims on certain parts of the land. So Jefferson wanted to get out there quickly. He chose Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to head an expedition into the territory. The expedition included 33 people, and all but one of them made it back. The only one who didn't make it back died of appendicitis. He did not die from anything on the expedition. They traveled from May 1804 to September 1806. So you see they acquired the territory in 1803, and very quickly in 1804, Jefferson was sending an expedition out to start mapping this territory. And you can see it lasted a little over 2 years. It took them that long to travel across the Louisiana Territory and come back to where there were known American settlements. They were searching for a water route that would connect the Missouri River with the Pacific Ocean. And this was for commerce. If they could reach the Pacific Ocean and they could reach potential new settlements along the river, then it would be easier to transport goods back and forth. So Jefferson wanted to know if this was a possibility, so Lewis and Clark were looking for a continuous water route. Though the expedition did make it all the way to the Pacific Ocean, they did not discover a continuous water route. So they could go a lot of the way on rivers, but there were the Rocky Mountains in the way and some other areas that cut off one water source from the next. So they weren't able to travel continually by water, but they did travel all the way from known American settlements up the Missouri River and some other rivers, and then across land until they reached the Pacific Ocean. And they'd gone further with mapping than any other Americans had gone. The expedition did draw a variety of maps. They recorded their encounters in detailed journals. And the expedition provided knowledge about the land they had traversed, as well as the plants, animals, and people that resided there. So while they didn't discover that continuous water route they were looking for, they were able to bring back a lot from their 2-year expedition. They brought maps, they brought detailed journals that were going to help future expeditions and travelers whenever they started heading out that way, and knowledge about plants, animals, and the people, the Native Americans that lived there. So they drew about 140 maps during their 2-year expedition. They noted over 70 native tribes that were along their route, and they recorded more than 200 new plant and animal species. So, while they didn't do everything they set out to do with finding that continuous water route, they did accomplish a lot. They drew these maps, they noted over 70 native tribes, they discovered lots of new plants and animals that had not been found in America before. And the Lewis and Clark expedition made a clear claim for America in the West, in the Louisiana Territory, and beyond, opening it all up for future expedition, future exploration, and settlement. So Jefferson did accomplish what he wanted to with putting a clear American claim on the land.
Today we want to go over the Missouri Compromise. And what we mean by that, we're talking about a compromise that was reached politically in the admission of Missouri as a territory to eventually form a state. And as our country grew and spread westward, there was the constant question of slavery entering in. And the whole idea was that America was sectionally divided north and south. And this north-south sectionalism showed itself as new states, new territories were brought into the Union. And the question was, would they be allowed to form a state government and write a state constitution that permitted or forbade slavery? Now, the way this was fought out was basically each state was allowed to send representatives to the House of Representatives on the federal level based on population. Now, the North was more populous, therefore they would have more representation. Well, they'd already come up with the 3/5 compromise, which said in the southern states they could count 3 out of every 5 slaves for the purposes of representation. And they also had to count those 3 out of every 5 for purposes of taxation. So that was the compromise. You get taxed on more of your population, but you also get representation from your population. So that solved sort of the situation in terms of the House of Representatives. Now, on the side of the Senate, each state got to send 2 representatives, no matter the size of the state. Big state, small state, all got 2. And so most of the power, in terms of power struggle, was localized in the Senate. And what the South sought to do was protect its institution, which was necessary, they felt, economically because of their large-scale manufacturing of cotton and tobacco and their need for a large workforce. They wanted to protect that, and so what they sought to do was to have an equal number of states that were pro-slavery to those that were anti-slavery. That way, the representation in the Senate, because they all get 2, would be equal. Well, recently, just prior to this, in 1819, Alabama had been admitted as a state and as a slave state, and with the admission of Alabama, the number of slave states and free states had once again been brought to equality. They were the same number. And with that equilibrium, they were happy. Well, Missouri was about to come in, and as Missouri was about to come in, that would suddenly tip the balance pro-slavery. There would now be one more slave state than there were non-slave states. And there was a big battle over that. Do we want to allow the Southern pro-slavery group to have more power and more representation than those of us from the Northeast who were here originally, the original colonies that were anti-slavery? What are we going to do? Well, at about the same time Missouri was seeking admission, Maine was seeking admission, and Maine would absolutely come in as a free state. And well, here we go. All politics, it says, is based on lies and compromise, and there's a lot of truth in that. Certainly on the compromise side, if we're going to have political things happen and people have to share power, some people have to give up something and give something in order for people to work together. So this compromise said, at the same time that Maine comes in as a free state, we'll admit Missouri as a slave state and keep the balance there. There'll still be the same number of states representing in the Senate, the free side as well as the slave side, with this added stipulation that in the territory west of Missouri and above the parallel line of 36 degrees 30 minutes, north of that and west of Missouri would be considered free. So if any of those areas, those territories got organized into states, they would automatically come in as free states and could not be considered for the pro-slavery side. And so that was sort of the compromise worked out. Maine comes in, Missouri comes in, and then from the parallel, which is the southern border of Missouri and west of the state, 36 degrees, 30 minutes, and north would be considered slave-free. There were other stipulations put in there that would encourage Northerners to return runaway slaves, that would basically help protect the institution of slavery and trade-offs that way. And basically all of this was just stopgap. Thomas Jefferson said, look, we are deeply divided as a nation. If we can't come together on this question one way or the other, it's going to lead to division and war. And it did, finally in the 1860s. So they kept limping along as best as they could with this compromise. It's part of a political power struggle because the North and South sectionalism. The admission of Alabama as a state made the number of free and slave states equal. They admitted Maine as a free state at the same time as Missouri as a slave state to keep the number equal. And this number is critical here, this 36 degrees, 30 minutes being the boundary. Everything north of that and west of Missouri and the Louisiana Purchase would be considered forever after free. Henry Clay is an important name to remember in this regard. The great compromiser. He was Speaker of the House and helped cobble a lot of this stuff together. Trying to make people, look, let's work together, let's find equality, let's find an answer. And the Missouri Compromise, as Thomas Jefferson said, was merely a temporary stopping point. They prolonged the inevitable. And this question of slavery versus freedom would not be decided until the 1860s and our bloody Civil War, which finally answered that question in favor of freedom. All right, well, this has just been a brief overview of the Missouri Compromise of 1820. If you'd like to learn more about this and related matters, underneath this video, you'll see a link. If you'll click on that link, it'll take you to the website that has that information. And while you're on that website, you'll also find a link to an ebook that's ready for immediate download.
Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order issued by President Abraham Lincoln on January 1st, 1863. And this was not something done by Congress. This was done solely by President Lincoln as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. So it did have a certain weight whenever he proclaimed all of this, but it wasn't, only Congress could declare war, and so it wasn't actually Congress saying it, it was just an executive order from President Lincoln. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation freed all slaves in Confederate states that had not ceased rebellion by the beginning of the year. So, Lincoln had issued a pre-proclamation. He had said, I will be issuing a proclamation on the 1st of the year. If by the time that January 1st rolls around, you haven't stopped rebelling, you haven't come back and joined the Union, then you will be subject to this proclamation. And he told all of the states that in September. So they had a few months to decide this, but the Confederate states that hadn't ceased rebellion were supposed to be under the jurisdiction of the Emancipation Proclamation. So what it said was that all the slaves in those Confederate states were free now. It effectively freed them. The proclamation stated that suitable ex-slaves, also known as freedmen, could join the paid service of the United States Armed Forces. So they had to be suitable. They pretty much only took men, and they were going to want healthy, younger men that could actually do some fighting. So suitable ex-slaves could join. They could be paid to be part of the Union Army. Lincoln ordered the Union Army to recognize and maintain the freedom of all freedmen who joined. So even though it's the Union Army, there were still going to be some people who didn't think that these people that had just been slaves a couple months before should be fighting with them. So he ordered the army to make sure that their freedom was recognized and maintained because he was serious about this. And because Lincoln was freeing them and giving them the option to fight and be paid to do so, several of the freedmen did join the armed services. Almost 200,000 black men fought in the Union Army, and approximately 10,000 served in the Navy. So this added a lot to the number of soldiers and the size of the army that Lincoln commanded. So they really helped in the war effort. And similarly, the South had lost a lot of the people that had lived there. They lost a lot of their population because even if they didn't follow the Emancipation Proclamation and let their slaves go, a lot of slaves would escape and get over state lines into free states, into what was considered the Union, and then they would be free. And then a lot of them would go and fight against the South for the Union Army. The proclamation also set a precedent for the emancipation of slaves as the war progressed. So as they moved steadily south and they started to control more southern areas, they would free the slaves in those areas. And it showed that ending slavery was a goal of the Union war effort. Lincoln started out just wanting to get the Union back together. Slavery was a big issue, but it wasn't all that they were fighting for. He just wanted to get the Union back together. The South were saying, no, we're going to rebel because we want to keep our slaves. The North was saying, well, we don't like you keeping your slaves, but we still want you to be part of the Union. The Confederate States said, no, we'll just make our own country and we'll have our slaves over here. And Lincoln wanted to prevent that. He wanted to keep the country together. And so that was what the primary goal was in the beginning. But after the Emancipation Proclamation, a huge goal became freeing all of the slaves and abolishing slavery. So that is all that the Emancipation Proclamation did do. Now, the proclamation did not free any slaves under Union control. So if there were some Confederate states that did go back under Union control by their deadline of January 1st, and the slaves in those states were not freed. They were still allowed to be kept as slaves until the end of the war. And so the Emancipation Proclamation did not actually abolish slavery. It didn't get rid of slavery altogether. It only got rid of slavery in the Confederate states that were rebelling against the Union. There was that goal of emancipating slaves as they moved south and, in the end, abolishing slavery, but the Emancipation Proclamation did not do that. It only abolished slavery and freed the slaves in the Confederate states that were not under Union control. And the proclamation did not make ex-slaves citizens. So yes, they were free, but they were not U.S. citizens yet. The Emancipation Proclamation did a lot in terms of moving forward the goal of emancipating slaves, and it enforced that freeing the slaves is going to be a major goal of the Civil War and on the northern side. And so that is why it was so important. President Abraham Lincoln showed that he wasn't messing around with the slavery issue. If the Union couldn't be returned to one whole country, then he was going to free all the slaves in the South and end this slavery thing for good. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't end slavery for good. That didn't happen until the 13th Amendment was added to the Constitution after the Civil War. But the proclamation did spur people to all unite under the goal in the North, and as far as the Union went, to end slavery. The Union decided ending slavery is one of our goals now. As we move through the South, we are going to free slaves. Where the Confederate was just trying to hang on to their slaves and maintain themselves as a new country. So the Emancipation Proclamation was very important in terms of reestablishing the goal of the Civil War as freeing slaves as the Union was reunited. There were many differences between the North and the South that affected the outcome of the Civil War. The northern side in the Civil War had 22 states with 22 million people. The Confederate States of America was comprised of 11 states with only 9 million people. So if you're just looking at numbers alone, the North has over twice as many people and exactly twice as many states. So the North did greatly outnumber the South as far as state and population numbers go. The North contained most of the United States coal, iron, and copper. As well as 92% of the industry. So as far as weapons were concerned, the South was basically stuck with what it had whenever the war began. The South didn't have the means, either material-wise or industrialization-wise, to be able to create a whole lot more in bulk for ammunition or for weapons. So the North had a big advantage there. They had the coal, iron, and copper deposits. They were able to use that to create more weapons and more ammunition as they needed them because they had 92% of the industry in that area already. The Union had more than twice as many railroad tracks as the Confederacy, and a vastly larger navy. So the Union had twice as many railroad tracks. That meant that the Union was going to be able to be twice as connected. They were going to be able to get to more places quickly. They were be able to transport troops, transport supplies, food, more weapons, ammunition. All of that was going to be able to be transported a lot quicker into more places in the North than in the South. The South was going to be slower about getting to transport those things because they didn't have as many railroad tracks to get them there. Now, when the war began, the South had no organized army or navy. At first, the troops were strictly volunteers, but eventually the Confederate States of America established a draft to bolster the ranks. So, to say that they had a vastly larger navy, the North over the South, was a bit of an overstatement because the South didn't really have an organized navy. It had some ships, but it wasn't an organized navy and there wasn't an organized army. So the South had to overcome that. Now at first they had strictly volunteers as soldiers, but eventually they did have a draft established to bolster the ranks. They didn't have as many soldiers as they needed, so they had to institute a draft to get more of them. So most importantly, perhaps for the Union, they had a huge advantage in troops. So we knew already that the North had over twice as many people, but that was also going to mean the North had more troops to actually go and fight the war. Most of the Northern troops were either volunteers, like the South, or had been conscripted starting in 1963. And conscripted is just another word for drafted. So in 1863, the North also started drafting people. However, it was permissible to pay a fee to get out of drafted service, or a substitution could be sent in your place. So this was a way to get around the draft for people who really didn't want to go, or to save people from having to go if they really shouldn't be, or you felt that they were too young or really needed to be at home. So if a young 18-year-old kid had been drafted and his dad didn't want him to go, his dad could be his substitution, or the family could pay a fee to keep that 18-year-old son from having to actually go and serve. So in one way or another, they were still going to help the cause. They were going to pay money, which could help feed troops, clothe troops, bring them more ammunition, more supplies. Or someone else would be sent in the drafted person's place. So they did have a bit of compromise there. You were able to get around actually having to go if you had the money or you had someone who would go in your place. The North generally had between 2 and 3 times as many troops as the South during the war. And this isn't surprising since they had over twice as many people living in the North. They were going to have 2 to 3 times as many people serving in the Northern Army. So the Union's biggest advantage was probably its number of troops. Now, the Confederacy may have been at a disadvantage in a lot of ways, but the Confederacy did have some advantages. They were fighting on their own soil, and so they already had interior lines of defense, as well as knowledge of the terrain. So Northerners were used to a certain climate, they were used to their terrain, so going and fighting in the South was going to be different to them. And the South already had lines of defense in place, where the North was having to build them as they moved down. So the South did have some advantages there since the war was being fought there. Now, in the end, this was going to be was also going to mean more devastation to the South because more land was going to get damaged, more homes are going to be destroyed. There was going to be a lot more damage in the South because the war was fought there. But during the war, this was an advantage to the South. On the whole, the Confederate commanders were more experienced and talented. So the North may have had more troops, but the South had commanders who had had more experience in battle and were more talented at commanding their troops, at commanding the smaller number of troops that they had. And finally, the Confederacy had a psychological advantage. They were fighting for a tangible reason, to preserve their lives and property, while the North had to motivate its troops with the notion of preserving the Union. So, the South was fighting to keep its way of life. They were trying to keep slavery intact, they were trying to keep their property, their slaves, and they were trying to keep their plantations able to run by keeping those slaves. So they knew if they lost the war and slavery was outlawed, then their way of life would be completely over. So they had something really tangible to fight for, where the North was just fighting to keep the Union together. The South left us, we have to go back and get them, keep the Union together. Now, most Northerners did want to free the slaves, and they did have other reasons for fighting, but it wasn't as concrete a reason as the South had. Every person in the South pretty much was used to a farming or plantation way of life. They were used to having slaves, and they didn't want that taken away from them. So they were fighting to keep something, where the North was just kind of fighting to put something back together, to keep the Union together. However, the South was really only able to survive so long because it fought a very defensive war. So they did have those interior lines of defense. They had those commanders who were more experienced and talented and knew what would work best for the South with its smaller number of troops. And so the South was able to make the Civil War last a lot longer than the North originally thought that it would last. And that's because it fought a very defensive war. So there were a lot of key differences between the North and the South during the Civil War that affected the eventual outcome. The North had way more people, which meant way more troops, usually 2 to 3 times as many troops. The North had most of the coal, iron, and copper, and 92% of the industry, so they were able to create more ammunition, create more weapons as they needed it, where the South was kind of stuck with what they had unless they stole it from the North, and so they didn't have that advantage. The North also had more railroad tracks to actually transport goods, transport soldiers, transport food, clothing, more ammunition and weapons, and they had twice as many railroad tracks to do this, where the South was going to be moving things at a slower pace. And then, of course, troops, the sheer number of troops that the North had outnumbering the South ended up being one of the biggest contributing factors to the Civil War. And so the North and South were very different, and they had to work hard in different ways during this war. So the North had to try to overcome the fact that the South was fighting on its own soil. The South had to try to overcome the fact that they were vastly out. The Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution in Europe in the 19th century produced immediate and far-reaching changes in the social structure. New energy sources, such as the steam engine, made great increases in productivity possible. So there were several different new energy sources. They found new ways to use water power. They found, such as with the steam engine, that's harnessing water as steam. They also found new ways to use coal, new ways to practice metallurgy. There was a lot of new ways to use energy that they'd previously used, or newfound sources of energy. And all of those things combined to increase productivity. The factory system for manufacturing textiles was implemented, meaning that individuals were only required to do one in a series of tasks required to prepare a piece of cloth. So each person would know how to do one job, or a couple people would know how to do one job, and then they'd do their one part and pass it off to the next step. And at the next step, a couple of people would know how to do that job, and so no one had to know how to make the whole piece or whole bolt of cloth. They only had to know how to do a certain part of it. And so this division of labor also increased productivity. Before, one person would do all the jobs, and they may be really good at one part but really bad at another part, or they may be really quick at one part but really slow at another part. So this let people work where their strengths could shine and where their strengths would get the most use. So someone who was really fast at the first step of the process could work there, someone who was really fast at the last step could work there, and all the spots in the middle. So everyone was trained to do just one in a series of tasks instead of one person having to do all the tasks. And that made things go quicker and increased productivity. So with the success of the textile industry and new energy resources, more and more workers were needed in European cities. So before, there were people in cities, but there were also a lot of people that lived out in the country on farms or had their own homes on a piece of land where they grew their own food. And there were people that flocked to the cities for art or learning, but they didn't really come there for work as much. Only the merchants could really get a job coming from the farmlands into the city. But now people began to abandon their country lives and take factory jobs in town, in different cities across Europe. Now, industrialization did come to England before it came anywhere else, but it quickly spread throughout Europe and then just a little while later over to America. So once it started, it spread quickly, but it did begin in England. Now, people left their country lives to go work in these factories because now there was a new job there. There was something they could go and have a possible better life than they did on their farms. And this rapid urbanization, which is when urban areas grow quickly, such as the areas within a city or surrounding a city, this rapid urbanization created a new middle class in Europe. So let's look at some of the pros to the urbanization and how that middle class developed. As people flooded the cities to work in booming factories, large landowners consolidated the farmlands they left behind. So people would flood to the cities to work, and they would sell off their farms so that they could make that move and have somewhere to live and a little bit of money to live on while they got set up in their new job. Large landowners would say, okay, we'll stay here and just keep taking all the land, we'll buy it off of them as they leave, and we'll have lots and lots of land, and we can do with it whatever we want to make the most money. So this was a good thing for the large landowners because they were going to be able to have more land. And it did give the people who were flocking to the cities a way to get a little money to start them off, but they were giving up the place that they had lived and had a home and had at least food to eat. Now, they may not have been able to make as much money. If they had just a small area to plant, they may have only been able to make enough food for themselves and not enough to make money. So moving into the cities gave them an opportunity to possibly be able to make more money and become wealthier as a family. The booming success of industry made many people rich as investors and merchants, and the middle class gained even more political power in Europe. So where the middle class didn't have as much political power because they weren't as wealthy as the upper class citizens, now the middle class was becoming richer and it was gaining more political power. Social mobility was much more possible in this economic environment, encouraging many people to stick with jobs that were demeaning and not especially lucrative. Well, social mobility is the idea that you can move from one class to another. So a lower class citizen who may have been virtually a peasant out on the farms may have moved in, got a factory job, people saw that he did a good job and he gets promoted and he makes way more money that way and can actually move up into the lower class and then move into the middle class and maybe even higher. But instead of being trapped in the class that you were born in, there's a lot more mobility. You could sell your farm that had made you plenty of money in hopes of going and investing in a factory in the city, and your factory could fail. So you could drop from middle class or upper middle class to lower class very quickly, or you could go as a peasant or a lower class farmer and do well in one of the factories or become a supervisor there, and you could end up making more money and rise from being lower class up to middle class or higher. So there was a lot more mobility here as far as social class goes, and the reason that I encouraged many people to stick with jobs that were demeaning and not very lucrative was that they had the opportunity to advance. So they may say, okay, well, I'm going to take this factory job. It's not paying me very much money. It's not paying me as much as I could have made on my farm. But if I do a good job, maybe I can move up. Maybe I can save up enough money to be able to invest in something. Maybe I can start my own factory someday. So people had ambition and they envisioned having more opportunity here rather than opportunities out on the farms. There wasn't as much available for them to move social class-wise out there, where in the cities, there was always that possibility. This rapid urbanization also created a number of problems. So many people moving to the city at once would create some problems. First of all, most cities did not have the infrastructure to support a large population explosion. So they didn't have the streets, first of all, but they also didn't have any of the city services in place for such a large population. They were used to maintaining who they had in the city, that level of a population that was slowly growing. They weren't used to having so many people come all at once. So they didn't have the housing, they didn't have sewer, they didn't have running water, they didn't have enough of anything really to take care of all these people. And the roadways, of course, weren't going to be used to having that much traffic on them, both foot traffic and different carts and different apparatuses that people are using to move all their stuff from the farm to the city. There's going to be a lot more traffic and there's going to be a lot more people. And the cities weren't prepared for that internally whenever all these people came. And as a result, disease, crime, and poverty were common. So you could end up moving from the lower class up to the middle class, but you could drop down from the middle class to the lower class, or you could just stay in the lower class if that's where you were. If you come in, you don't have a lot of money, you don't have somewhere to stay, you can't stay in an inn, you don't have the money for it, you can't buy your own home. There's a lot that you don't have access to in the city without money. And so poverty was common. Crime was common. If you didn't have money and you couldn't get a factory job, or you weren't making enough of the factory job and your family still needed to eat, then you may steal from someone to be able to make ends meet. And so crime was common. And then disease. With so many people living so closely together, if one person got sick, it was going to spread very quickly, and so disease was common. So there were some negatives to this rapid urbanization. And working class individuals. Now, we talked about how they had the possibility to move up, but we also talked about how they may stick with jobs that were demeaning and not very lucrative. So some working class individuals were probably not pleased with their new lives. They had 18-hour days sometimes, many times. They had low wages. The factory owners knew all these people wanted to work in factories, so they didn't have to pay them that much. They just had to pay them enough that they could get workers in the door. And if people were waiting in line to work there, you didn't have to pay them that much more. You could just pay them the bare minimum that they would come to work for. And dangerous machinery. These factories had people working in there, but they were also full of dangerous machines, and so that was something that you had to worry about on a daily basis if you are working in a factory. And They also, you have to think about who was working. Women and children also worked. So the men were going into these dangerous machinery-filled factories and working these 18-hour days for low wages, but women and children were doing the same thing, and they were often paid less than men. And they were also usually given the most menial jobs. So if they thought the men could lift stuff and they could figure stuff out better, then they would be given better jobs. The women and children may have been given jobs that were more along the lines of cleaning up after people, sweeping, washing dishes, sewing. They weren't going to be given the better jobs. They were going to be given worse jobs, harder jobs sometimes, and they were going to be paid less than men. So they were working in these same dangerous conditions a lot of the time, but being paid less. So while there were some benefits to people moving very quickly to the city, there were also some drawbacks as well. A small rebellion led by a group called the Luddites tried to resist industrialization and were known for vandalizing factory equipment. So they were one group who did not like this industrialization. They didn't like all the bad things they saw come with it, and they didn't like the social class changing, and they said, okay, we don't want all this industrialization. We want things to kind of stay how they were, but that didn't really work out. For the most part, people were optimistic about the prospect of upward mobility. They thought they might be able to move from a lower social class to a higher one. And they were willing to endure hardship for hope. So even though they were working these bad jobs for low pay, they had that hope, that option that they could advance, that they could make more money, that they could have better lives here in the city. So the Industrial Revolution was just whenever, all at once in the 19th century, very quickly energy sources came along that were new to people and increased productivity. And one of the big things was that the factory system came about, where each person would work on one step in the process and it would get things done quicker. That division of labor increased productivity. And with all of this, with the factory system, there was a rapid increase of population to cities throughout Europe. World War I, an overview. In the years before the First World War, the Balkans were attempting to gain independence from the Habsburg Empire of Austria. So the Balkans were a conglomeration of city-states on the Balkan Peninsula. And so different city-states within the Balkans, or that resided geographically on the Balkan Peninsula, didn't like being a part of the Austrian Empire, and so they were trying to gain their independence from Austria. The insurrection from this independence movement culminated in the assassination of Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 by Gavrilo Princip, a member of a Serbian nationalist group. So the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was in line for the throne. He was an heir to the throne. And so since the Serbian nationalist group, Serbia being one of these Balkan city-states, had sent a member of their group to assassinate this Austrian Archduke, there was a big problem here. And at this point, a chain reaction of war declarations, spurred by the comprehensive alliances of the time, ensued. So because lots of different nations in Europe at this time had formed alliances, when one country declared war, other countries in their alliance were supposed to back them up. So obviously, Austria was going to declare war against Serbia, because Serbia had sent one of its members to assassinate the Austrian heir. Then Germany and Turkey joined with the Austrians. Germany and Austria had been in the Triple Alliance together. Therefore, Germany was supposed to back up Austria, and it did. And Turkey also joined with them. Russia declared war on these countries in support of Serbia. So Russia agreed and said, yes, you should be independent. We're going to back you up against the Austrians. France joined with Russia because France, Russia, and Britain had been in the Triple Entente alliance together. And Britain and Italy joined with France, even though Italy had been a member of the Triple Alliance. Originally, Italy, Germany, and Austria were the members of the Triple Alliance, the larger powers of Europe that were members of the Triple Alliance. But Italy backed out on that alliance and instead sided with the Triple Entente group. Despite the fact that almost every nation in Europe had entered into this war, most Europeans thought the conflict would be brief. They figured, okay, we've all backed up the people we're supposed to back up. Now this war is just going to end quickly and things will go back to normal. But that's not what happened. Instead, advances in weapons technology made the war bloody and excruciatingly slow. Much of the fighting was done from trenches. So the soldiers would hide in trenches until they could make a move forward or until they could perform some kind of military maneuver to get some ground. But a lot of the time they were hiding in their trenches waiting. And some battles saw the deaths of thousands of soldiers at one time. So this did become a very bloody war. The war was also slow because the sides were very evenly matched. Large countries had come to back up both Austria and Serbia, which meant that the sides ended up being evenly matched by the size of the countries, the availability of troops and supplies. And so being evenly matched, it made it harder for you to just instantly win. You weren't going to win quickly if the sides were evenly matched. If no one had declared war with Austria, if Germany and Turkey hadn't backed them up and had instead backed up Serbia, then Austria would have been all alone against almost every other European nation, and they would have lost quickly. But since large countries had come to both of these smaller countries' defenses, now they're pretty evenly matched. At least until 1917, when the United States entered on the side of Britain, which means they would have been backing up Serbia as well, but really they were there because Britain was there and they had another kind of alliance of their own where the United States said, okay, I'll help you, Britain. They weren't necessarily saying, I'm going to help Serbia, but in the chain reaction of countries declaring war, that is what they were doing. Also in 1917, the Russians exited the war via the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. And Russia was basically exhausted after suffering through a revolution in 1917 in which the Bolsheviks came to power. So Russia wasn't trying to bail on Serbia after declaring their support. They just were exhausted. They didn't have the troops, they didn't have the supplies, they were already messed up internally because they had had this internal revolution, and so they signed a treaty all on their own and backed out of World War I. And the entry of the United States provided the British and French with supplies. So where things may have been running low, where some of these other countries, Germany, Turkey, Austria, may have blocked off supply lines to the countries on Serbia's side, now the United States was bringing in fresh supplies for Britain and France. And troops. They sent over troops as well. So where thousands had died, now the Serbian side was getting more troops, where the Austrian side didn't have any new troops coming forward. And Germany was soon forced to call a truce. And even though it was Austria and Serbia that had originally started this war, Germany was the biggest country in power over on the Austrian side, so it came to Germany to call a truce, because once that biggest country decided they were going to end up calling a truce and backing down, the other countries would have to do the same. So World War II started because one little country was trying to gain independence from another country. When the one little country sent an assassin to go the Holocaust. The Holocaust is the name given to the systematic killing of Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, and others by the Nazis before and during World War II. So this is something that happened in Germany and German-occupied territory, and the German Nazis were the ones who carried it out. It was their leader, Hitler's, goal to eradicate all Jews from Germany and from Europe. And so it was a systematic killing of Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, and others. So there were other targets, but it was primarily Jews that were targeted. And anti-Semitism which is the hatred of Jews, had existed in Europe for millennia. So it had existed for thousands of years in Europe. Hating the Jews was not a new thing for Europeans, but the Nazis gave it renewed emphasis because they felt that their race was superior and this inferior race needed to be destroyed. And after making numerous false claims about the Jews, if they said bad things about the Jews, it would be easier to get people on board with getting rid of them. So after they made many false claims about the Jews, they began persecuting them upon Hitler's rise to power in 1933. So you see that even if they didn't start killing them right away, this system, the systematic killing, the system of persecution and eventually killing them began around the time that Hitler rose to power. And they were being targeted because they were Jewish, and that was it. It wasn't because they were actually doing anything wrong or provoking any kind of attacks, but the Nazis started to round up the Jews and started to take away some of their rights and privileges and property, and then they eventually started to carry out the rest of this system and begin killing them. So at the beginning, Jews were disenfranchised, which meant they lost the right to vote. They were forced into ghettos where they lived. And these would be areas that were small in size and didn't have a ton of houses compared to the number of people that were forced to live there. And all the Jews were forced to live there together so they could be kind of closed off from the outside populace. They weren't supposed to live in the same area. They were all supposed to be, the Jews were all supposed to be living in one area where the other German people lived in other areas outside of those ghettos. They had their property taken away, so if they were living in one home, they may have been forced to leave that home, give up all their possessions in that home, and move into one of these ghettos. And they were finally sent to work and then be killed in concentration camps. And these were basically like prisons where the people were kept and forced to work until they either died or until they were killed in mass murders, basically. They went about it different ways. Some were poisoned in gas chambers, others were killed in different ways, but in all, approximately 6 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust. That is a huge number of people to be killed, and this was primarily in Europe, and this was just over the course of maybe 10 to 15 years when Hitler came to power and then through World War II. Now at the end of World War II, the Holocaust ended because Germany was defeated. But over that period of time, 6 million Jews were killed simply because they were Jewish. There wasn't a good reason for this, only that the German people felt that they were superior, and this was Hitler's goal, to eradicate the Jewish race. As the situation for the Germans became more dire during World War II, whenever the Germans saw that they were losing ground, when they had all this territory, but they were losing it, and the opposing forces were making them retreat further and further, and they saw that it was likely that they were going to lose the war, Hitler sought to implement what he called the final solution, in which hundreds of thousands were killed just before Germany fell. So that would be just before Nazi Germany fell to the Allied troops. So the final solution was what Hitler called the final solution to the Jewish problem. And his solution was just to kill them all and get rid of the race. And so since he'd already killed a lot, but they hadn't just been killed, they had been sent to concentration camps where they were made to work, and some had died, but they weren't just killed all at once. But in the last little bit of World War II, when the Germans saw the end coming, they tried to hurry up and kill as many Jews as they could before they lost the war and finish carrying out the final solution. Obviously, they didn't kill all the Jews, but they did kill hundreds of thousands more just before the end of the war, and around 6 million Jews total throughout the Holocaust. So this was still a huge impact and a huge dent in the Jewish population. And this was Hitler's goal, which he promoted and sold to the German people. The German people believed what Hitler was saying about their race being superior and about the need to get rid of the Jewish problem. And so these people were simply killed for being Jewish. Now, there were, of course, consequences following the Holocaust, and these consequences were for the Germans, the Jews, and for the rest of the world, because this was such a dramatic event. Many of the Nazi leaders were tried and convicted at the Nuremberg trials for their roles in the Holocaust. So Hitler committed suicide right before the Germans fell. He saw the end was near, he committed suicide. Some of the other higher up German leaders either committed suicide themselves or they were killed before they were captured. But there were still plenty of Nazi leaders that had participated in promoting the Holocaust, promoting the killing of Jews. And so those leaders were tried and convicted at what were known as the Nuremberg trials for their roles in the Holocaust. West Germany would later issue a federal compensation law which gave billions of dollars to survivors. So surviving Jews who had made it out of Germany or out of Europe, who had hid away long enough for the war to end and for the Nazi leaders to be dealt with so that they could come out and be free. These survivors were paid altogether billions of dollars through the federal compensation law in West Germany. During and after the Holocaust, Zionist Jews fled to Palestine. They said, okay, we'll get out of Europe, we'll go to the Holy Land that we can all flock to together and make a Jewish majority there. Public sympathy with their plight would be a main reason for the creation of Israel in 1948. So the state of Israel was created for the Jewish people after World War II, after the Holocaust, because people felt so bad about what had been done to the Jews that they said, okay, we will set up the state of Israel for the Jewish people. And that is the only place in the world where there is a Jewish majority. So there still are Jews that travel there either to visit because it is their holy land or try to go and live there. So there are still Zionist Jews who are trying to promote more people to move into Israel to give them an even bigger majority. But after the Holocaust, And during the Holocaust, there was a mass flood of Jews into Palestine as they were trying to leave and escape what was happening in Europe. And so the ones who made it there, the survivors, eventually got to live in what was created for them as the State of Israel. The total destruction of the Jewish community in Europe caused many Jews to question their faith. When the Jews who stayed in Europe and saw the total destruction, saw friends and family members killed or taken away, never to return, this shook their faith. This made a lot of them question their faith. How could God let this happen to them? And those that remained in Europe were and have been markedly more secular than their ancestors, which just means that they let more of an influence from the world come into their lives. They don't practice Judaism as devoutly as their ancestors had. They may give in and take on more worldly customs, not practice all of the Jewish holidays the same that their ancestors would have, and so Judaism may not be as prominent as a part of their life as it was for their ancestors, because they kind of lost some of their faith seeing what had happened during the Holocaust. The shock of the Holocaust also caused many institutions, including the Roman Catholic Church, to consider their own underlying anti-Semitism. Remember, we talked about how anti-Semitism was not something new for Europe. It was something that had been going on for thousands of years. And the Roman Catholic Church was another group that looked down on Jews and said that they weren't practicing what they should be practicing because they weren't practicing what the Roman Catholic Church preached. And so there was some anti-Semitism coming from there. But any groups, including the Roman Catholic Church, who had previously practiced anti-Semitism really took a step back and looked at what they'd been saying and what they'd been doing, and many tried to correct that because they saw what a terrible devastation had occurred with the Jewish population due to the eccentric and extreme anti-Semitism that Hitler and the Nazis practiced. And they didn't want anything like that to happen again. And so many of the people who, or groups who had practiced anti-Semitism in the past kind of withdrew from that and at least made some changes for a more positive future. And then anti-genocide legislation was created in response to the Holocaust. Well, genocide is the extermination of a whole group based on their race, nationality, ethnicity, their historical background, what that group holds closely. So it could be a race, it could be a nation, it could just be an ethnicity, but trying to exterminate a whole group based on that kind of consideration, that is what genocide is. So anti-genocide legislation was created in response to the Holocaust because, of course, the Holocaust was just genocide of the Jews. But unfortunately, it was not strict enough to rally international support against the Hutu Rwandans, who slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Tutsis in 1994. So, as recently as 1994, we had people in Rwanda. You had the Hutus and the Tutsis, and those were the two major groups within Rwanda. Well, the Hutus had the majority, and the Tutsis were in the minority. And simply because the Tutsis were Tutsis, the Hutus slaughtered hundreds of thousands of them. And even though we had these anti-genocide laws in place, they weren't strict enough for international support to come to the Tutsis' rescue. You didn't have a lot of countries coming in and saying, whoa, 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 stop this, we're going to back up the Tutsis, you can't just kill them because of their historical ties, because they are that one group. So even as recently as 1994, we had something similar occur. And then the Bosnian Serbs and Croats also killed thousands of Muslims in the early 1990s. So again, pretty recently, we had a group being persecuted simply for what they believed because of their religious inclination. So even though we had the Holocaust to kind of teach us a lesson, there are still places in the world where there's going to be genocide, where there are going to be people persecuted or killed simply because of their beliefs or their ethnicity or their nationality. There are some laws in place to protect against that, but it doesn't mean that every country is going to follow them and rush to these people's defense. So the Holocaust was something that occurred in Europe from around the time Hitler came into power in 1933 through the end of World War II. And it was the systematic rounding up and persecution and killing of the Jews throughout that period until approximately 6 million were killed. This was what Hitler referred to as a final solution. He was trying to get rid of the Jewish problem because he felt, and many of his supporters felt, that the Aryan race, the German people, were superior to other races, and that meant that the Jews were inferior and they wanted to get rid of them. There were consequences to this. Many of those Nazi leaders were tried and convicted for their crimes. There was some compensation for survivors in that West Germany paid billions of dollars out to surviving Jews after World War II. But there were also some negative consequences. Many of the Jews who survived and still live in Europe lost some of their faith and don't practice Judaism as devoutly as their ancestors did because their faith was shaken by this event. And we did, of course, have one more positive outcome in that all the Jews flocking to Palestine led to public sympathy supporting the creation of the State of Israel. So that was another good thing to come out of this. But the Holocaust was a terrible time and event during World War II and a little bit before, where the Jews were systematically rounded up and killed by the Nazi Germans. Karl Marx. The political theories of socialism and communism both take their inspiration from the works of Karl Marx, who lived from 1818 to 1883. Marx declared that economics have been the primary influence on history, and that history is nothing more than a history of class struggles. So Marx felt like the struggle between classes based on economics was basically what history was. History was just the telling of the struggles between different economic classes, or clashes over economics. Marx asserted that problems have been created in situations where the material that a worker produces is worth more than the compensation he receives for his work. So the worker knows that what he's producing is worth more than what he's being paid. He's being paid a certain amount. He knows the item he just made is worth way more than that. The surplus, what's left over after this item is sold and the man is paid, goes to a capitalist owner. If the man were to work faster and make more of these items or become better at making these items, he didn't necessarily get more money because of that. The owner might have given him a raise, but it wasn't necessarily true. It wasn't necessarily going to happen. And so this capitalist owner was going to be the one who kept getting the surplus, who kept making a profit off of this man's or this worker's production. And the worker's caught in a situation where he can never advance. The capitalist is going to be the one who keeps making a profit, where the worker keeps making the same amount as long as the economy doesn't dictate that the owner has to pay him more or he will lose workers. According to Marx, the inevitable result is a revolution of the working class, which he called the proletariat. So Marx said eventually the working class is going to revolt. They're going to say, this isn't fair. We need to change things. It's not fair for me to work really hard and make this product and only get a little bit of money, and you sell the product and didn't have to do any of the work making it, and you get the surplus. You get the extra money from this, and I don't see anything extra. So Marx said that the inevitable result after this revolution is that a classless society will be installed, and an economic system similar to socialism or communism will be installed. So first of all, there'll be a classless society. People won't necessarily have social classes anymore. Everything will be equal. There'll be social equality, so there aren't going to be poor people and really rich people. Everyone will make about the same amount of money because the wealth will be evenly distributed. And this is an idea found in both socialism and communism, where land and property don't belong just to one person, they belong to the country, they belong to everyone. So everyone has a right to these things. Items are made in factories, or foods are grown and produced only for what the citizens need, not for profit. They're not created with the goal of how much can we make, how much can we ship out somewhere else and sell and make a profit. Things are only made or grown so that the needs are met for that society. So both socialism and communism have their roots in Karl Marx's writings, his thoughts, and these were based on Marx's theories about economics and how they were the primary influence on history. Anything noteworthy in history is going to be able to be traced back to economics and how that influenced the class struggles. And he also argued that any system that is trying to be a capitalist system is eventually going to fall apart because the working class will revolt and try to establish either a socialist or communist system in its place.